You clearly don't understand how community access rights work in a civilized neighborhood, do you, sweetie?
Margot Blackwood stood at my locked gate in her signature light blue suit, clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield of righteousness. Behind her, 43 residents clutched fishing poles and folding chairs, their faces mixing confusion with practiced indignation. I held the key to my own property in my hand, watching this woman who'd terrorized my grandfather for 5 years before his death. The same woman who'd just brought a small army to my private fishing lake at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, demanding access to waters that had belonged to my family since 1963. If you've ever had someone try to steal what your family built with their bare hands, you'll understand why what happened next felt like justice served ice cold. Quick question though. Where are you watching this story from? Drop your country in the comments while I show you exactly how federal law deals with HOA overreach. The morning mist still clung to Clearwater Lake's surface behind my property line, where my grandfather's hand-built dock stretched 20 feet into water so clear you could count the bass swimming beneath. This wasn't some community amenity or public fishing hole. This was private land, protected by 60 years of family ownership and a chain-link fence that had never seen a single day of legitimate dispute until Margot Blackwood became HOA president 12 years ago. "Ma'am, this is private property," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I've already explained this in writing. There's no public access easement, no community fishing rights, and no historical claim to my family's lake." Margot's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, honey, that's where you're absolutely wrong. We have documentation going back decades. My board has voted unanimously to restore traditional community access, and your little gate situation is going to be resolved today." She gestured to clipboard Craig Morrison, a nervous man in khakis who stepped forward waving what looked like official documents. His hands trembled slightly as he held up papers that I could see from 6 feet away were printed on regular office paper, not the watermarked legal documents they were pretending to be. "Sir," Craig said, his voice cracking on the word, "I'm a certified property inspector, and these documents clearly show established community fishing access dating back to 1978. You're required by county ordinance to provide reasonable accommodation for historical recreational use." The crowd behind them murmured agreement, though I noticed several faces showing uncertainty rather than conviction. Eleanor Whitman, an elderly woman in a sun hat, looked genuinely confused. A middle-aged man I didn't recognize kept checking his phone like he'd rather be anywhere else. What none of them knew was that I'd spent 11 years as a federal fish and wildlife inspector before retiring to write nature guides. What they definitely didn't know was that every word coming out of their mouths was being recorded by the discreet digital recorder in my shirt pocket, and that I'd already documented every aspect of this confrontation with my phone camera. "May I see those documents?" I asked Craig, extending my hand. He clutched the papers closer to his chest. "These are official inspection records. You don't have authority to review them. Actually, if they pertain to my property, I have every legal right to examine them. And if you're claiming to be a county inspector, I'd like to see your credentials." Craig's face went pale. He looked back at Margot, who stepped forward with renewed aggression. "We don't need to show you anything," she declared. "This community has been fishing this lake since before you were born, young man. My residents have established rights through decades of continuous use, and your grandfather never once objected to community access." That's where her mistake became unforgivable. My grandfather had spent the last 5 years of his life fighting Margot's increasingly aggressive attempts to claim his property. The stress of her constant legal threats, her harassment of anyone who tried to visit him, and her campaign to paint him as a selfish old man hoarding community resources had literally contributed to his heart attack. My grandfather objected every single day for 5 years, I said, my voice hardening. He documented every conversation, every threat, every piece of harassment. I have his journals, his correspondence with your board, and recordings of the voicemails you left threatening legal action if he didn't open his property to your members. Margot's confident expression flickered for just a moment. That's completely false. Your grandfather was a wonderful man who understood community cooperation. My grandfather died of stress-induced cardiac arrest after receiving a legal demand letter from your HOA claiming he owed $47,000 in fines for blocking community access to his own property. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people lowered their fishing poles. Eleanor Whitman removed her sun hat and stared at Margot with new attention. Now, I continued, I'm going to ask you one more time to leave my property. Take your fake inspector, your fraudulent documents, and your manufactured emergency and leave. If you want to discuss access rights, you can contact my attorney. Margot's face flushed red above her light blue collar. We're not going anywhere. This is a community matter, and it's going to be resolved today. Craig, proceed with the inspection. Craig took a hesitant step toward my gate, then stopped when I held up my phone with the recording app clearly visible. I should mention, I said casually, that impersonating a government official is a federal crime punishable by up to 3 years in prison. Trespassing on posted private property is a misdemeanor, and conspiracy to deprive someone of their property rights under color of law is a civil rights violation that carries some very serious penalties. The legal terminology hit Craig like a physical blow. His hands started shaking so badly he nearly dropped his fake documents. Several people in the crowd began backing away from the gate. But Margot had gone too far to retreat now. Her whole body language screamed desperation, disguised as righteous indignation. You can throw around all the legal threats you want, she snapped. I know exactly what I'm doing. This community has rights, and I've been protecting those rights for 12 years. You think you can just show up here and take away something that's been ours since before your grandfather even owned this land? Since before my grandfather owned it? I pulled out my phone and opened the photo album I'd prepared for exactly this moment. This is a picture of my grandfather at age 16, standing on the dock he built with his father in 1963. Here's another one from 1965 with the property survey markers he installed. And this one is from 1978, the same year you claim community access was established, showing the no trespassing signs he posted after people started leaving trash and damaging his property. I held the phone so the front row of residents could see the images. Eleanor Whitman stepped closer, squinting at the photographs. I remember that dock, she said slowly. My husband used to walk by when we were dating, back in the 70s. That old man was always there, fixing something or feeding the fish. He had a dog that would bark if anyone got too close. Margot spun toward Eleanor. Eleanor, you're confused. That's not relevant to current access rights. But Eleanor wasn't finished. Margot, you told us the lake had been community property since the neighborhood was developed. You said the previous owner had abandoned it, and we had squatters' rights or something. That's adverse possession, Margot said quickly. And yes, that's exactly what happened. Legal abandonment creates community access through established use patterns. I pulled up another photo. Here's a picture from last year, 3 months before my grandfather died. Notice the brand new no trespassing signs, the repaired fence line, and the freshly painted gate. Does this look like abandoned property to you? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. I could see doubt spreading through the crowd like ripples on water. Several people were now staring at Margot with obvious questions in their eyes. That's when Vernon Ashworth appeared at the edge of the group, walking slowly but purposefully toward the gate. I'd never met the man, but I recognized him from my grandfather's descriptions. Former HOA treasurer, retired accountant, mid-70s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Margot," Vernon said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades balancing books and catching discrepancies. "I think we need to talk." Margot's face went white. "Vernon, this isn't the time for board discussion. We're handling a community access issue." "No," Vernon said firmly, "we're not. And you know exactly why we're not." He approached me directly, ignoring Margot's increasingly frantic gestures. "Mr. Knox, I believe. I was sorry to hear about your grandfather. He was a good man who deserved better treatment than he received." "Thank you," I said. "I assume you're Vernon Ashworth?" "Former HOA treasurer until 2 years ago, yes. I resigned when I could no longer support certain board decisions." He glanced at Margot, then back to me. "I think you and I need to have a private conversation. Soon." Margot stepped between us. "Vernon, whatever you're thinking of saying, remember your confidentiality obligations to the board." Vernon's smile was thin but determined. "Margot, some obligations become void when they're used to cover up fraud." The word fraud hit the crowd like a thunderclap. People started talking among themselves, voices rising with confusion and concern. Craig Morrison backed away from the gate entirely, clutching his fake documents like they might spontaneously combust. "This conversation is over," Margot announced, her voice cracking slightly. "Everyone back to the community center. We'll be discussing next steps at an emergency board meeting tonight." But the crowd wasn't moving with the same unified purpose they'd shown an hour earlier. People were breaking into smaller groups, questioning each other, looking back at my property with new understanding. Eleanor Whitman approached the gate one more time. "Mr. Knox, I want to apologize. I think some of us were given information that wasn't completely accurate." "I understand, Mrs. Whitman. You were told something by people you trusted. That's not your fault." She nodded gratefully, then turned to face Margot. "I'll be attending that board meeting tonight, and I'll be bringing questions." As the crowd finally began to disperse, Vernon lingered near my gate. Margot was 50 yards away, arguing intensely with Craig Morrison, while gesturing angrily in our direction. "Mr. Knox," Vernon said quietly, "I have some things your grandfather would have wanted you to know. Things about what's really been happening with this HOA for the past 8 years. Can you meet me somewhere private? This afternoon?" "What kind of things?" Vernon glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot. "The kind that explains why Margot is so desperate to get control of your lake that she's willing to bring 40 people to your gate with fraudulent documents. The kind that involves bank records, email chains, and recorded conversations about development deals that would make your head spin." The pieces started clicking into place. This wasn't about community fishing rights or historical access. This was about money, serious money. And my lake was somehow the key to a much bigger scheme. "There's a coffee shop called Miller's about 5 miles east on County Road 12, I said. "Can you meet me there at 2 o'clock? Vernon nodded. "I'll bring documentation. Mr. Knox, your grandfather tried to warn people about what was happening, but nobody would listen. Maybe it's time someone finally did." After Vernon left, I stood alone at my gate, watching the last stragglers make their way back to the subdivision. My phone showed 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, and 2 text messages from what appeared to be reporters who'd somehow already heard about the confrontation. The afternoon sun was warming the air, and I could see fish jumping in the calm water, where my grandfather had taught me to cast a line 30 years ago. This lake held more than just family memories. It held 60 years of careful stewardship, conservation, and love for the natural world my grandfather had dedicated his life to protecting. What I hadn't told Margot, or Vernon, or anyone else, was that my 11 years with fish and wildlife had given me access to federal databases that most people didn't even know existed. I'd already run comprehensive environmental and ownership reports on every piece of property within a 2-mile radius of my lake. What I'd found was far more explosive than a simple HOA land grab. If Vernon's documentation matched what I'd discovered in the federal records, Margot Blackwood wasn't just violating local property laws. She was potentially in violation of the Clean Water Act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and several other environmental protection statutes that carried criminal penalties. At 1:55 that afternoon, I pulled into Miller's coffee shop parking lot and saw Vernon already waiting in a corner booth, a thick manila folder on the table in front of him. He'd changed from his casual morning clothes into a pressed shirt and tie like he was preparing for a business meeting. "Mr. Knox, Nisem," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming. I ordered you coffee. Black, if that's all right." "That's perfect. Thank you." I slid into the booth across from him, noting how he'd positioned himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of both the front door and the parking lot. This wasn't paranoia. This was the behavior of someone who'd been threatened. Vernon opened the folder and pulled out the first document. "Before we start, I need to ask you something. How much do you know about Grandview Resort Development?" "Never heard of them." "They're a resort and spa company based in Atlanta. Very high-end, very exclusive, very expensive. They specialize in converting natural lake properties into luxury destinations." He slid a glossy brochure across the table. "This is their most recent project, a 150-room resort built around a private fishing lake in North Carolina. The total development cost was $42 million. I flipped through the brochure, noting the pristine lake views, the carefully manicured grounds, the luxury cabins and 5-star dining facilities. This looks exactly like my property. That's not a coincidence. Vernon pulled out another document, a detailed site assessment report with my property address clearly visible at the top. Grandview had your lake surveyed 6 months ago. Professional geological assessment, environmental impact study, infrastructure planning, and the works. The blood drained from my face. How did they get access to survey my property? They didn't survey your property. They surveyed what Margot told them was community-owned recreation land available for development partnership. Vernon's expression was grim. According to this report, Margot presented herself as the authorized representative for a community development board with full authority to negotiate access and usage rights. I stared at the survey report, recognizing my grandfather's dock, the exact configuration of the shoreline, even the specific species of trees espoused that surrounded the water. This is fraud. She can't negotiate development rights for property she doesn't own. It gets worse. Vernon pulled out a stapled contract with Margot's signature clearly visible at the bottom. This is a letter of intent between Margot Blackwood, acting as HOA president, and Grandview Resort Development. If she can deliver clear title or exclusive access rights to the lake property, they'll pay her a finder's fee of $2.8 million. My hands were shaking as I read through the contract terms. The document was professionally prepared, notarized, and legally binding. Margot had committed herself to delivering my property to developers, and she'd already accepted a $50,000 advance payment against her commission. "Vernon, how long has this been in the works?" 8 months. The initial approach from Grandview came through a property scout who'd identified your lake as an ideal development site. Margot saw an opportunity and told them she could handle the community relations and property acquisition. He pulled out another document. This is where it gets interesting. Margot told Grandview that your grandfather was willing to sell, but that there were some community resistance issues that needed to be managed. Community resistance to my grandfather selling his own property? She convinced them that certain residents had established usage rights that would need to be honored in any development deal. Basically, she positioned herself as the solution to a problem she created. Vernon's voice carried decades of professional disgust for creative accounting. She's been collecting developer money while simultaneously building a legal case for community access rights. I sat back in the booth, trying to process the full scope of what I was hearing. So this morning's confrontation wasn't about fishing rights at all. This morning was Margot's attempt to establish documented community usage that she could present to Grandview as proof of her influence and control. Vernon pulled out his phone and showed me a text message thread. Look at this conversation from last night. The messages were between Margot and someone named Derek Simmons at Grandview Development. Margot's texts were time-stamped from 11:47 p.m. the night before. Community demonstration scheduled for 7:30 a.m. will document established access patterns and resident support. Should have usage proof for your legal team by the end of the week. Derek's response: excellent. Board meeting scheduled for Friday. Need clear documentation of community control before we can proceed with Phase 2 funding. Phase 2 funding? I looked up at Vernon. $15 million. Grandview's total budget for land acquisition, community relations, and initial development costs. Vernon's expression was deadly serious. Margot isn't just trying to steal your lake for the HOA. She's trying to steal it from developers who are planning to turn it into a luxury resort destination. Now I need to ask you something. If you found out your neighbors had been lied to for years by someone they trusted, would you stay silent or speak up? Let me know in the comments, because Vernon's decision changed everything. Vernon reached into the folder and pulled out what looked like a small digital recording device. There's something else. Something that's going to change how you see this entire situation. He pressed play, and Margot's voice filled the space between us, clear and unmistakable. The fish population needs to be managed anyway. Derek's environmental people can handle that during the pre-development phase. A couple of targeted treatments to reduce the base numbers. Maybe some algae blooms to create justification for restoration. Nothing that can't be reversed later, but enough to support our narrative about neglected community resources. The recording continued with another voice I didn't recognize. What about the property owner? Knox might notice if the water quality changes. Margot's laugh was cold. Knox is one person against a community board and a professional development team. If he wants to fight, we'll exhaust him with legal costs and community pressure. Grandfather learned that lesson the hard way. My hands clenched into fists. They'd been planning to poison my lake to create justification for taking it over. They'd been planning to use my grandfather's death as a timeline opportunity. Vernon stopped the recording. There's 6 hours of conversations like that. Margot has been planning this scheme for 8 months, collecting money from developers while building fraudulent community claims to your property. Where did you get these recordings? Board meetings. I started recording them 2 years ago when I noticed discrepancies in our financial reporting. Margot didn't know that my hearing aid has Bluetooth capability. Vernon's smile was sharp. 20 years of corporate auditing teaches you to document everything. I stared at the evidence spread across the table. Contracts, surveys, bank records, recorded confessions. This wasn't just property theft. This was an organized conspiracy involving fraud, environmental crimes, and potentially racketeering. Vernon, why are you showing me this now? You could have come forward months ago. Vernon's expression softened. Because I'm 76 years old, and I've been afraid. Margot has connections. Her brother-in-law is a county judge. Her cousin runs the largest law firm in town. She's threatened to destroy anyone who opposes her. But after what I saw this morning, watching her lie to 40 innocent people about community access rights, he shook his head. Some things matter more than personal safety. I gathered up the documents, my mind racing through the federal statutes I'd enforced for over a decade. Vernon, these aren't just local property crimes. Margot has violated the Clean Water Act by planning to contaminate a protected waterway. She's committed mail fraud by using HOA communications to further her scheme. And if she's been using federal waterway access routes in her surveys, she's violated federal environmental protection laws. What does that mean? It means this isn't a matter for county courts or local law enforcement. This is a federal case. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in 3 years. I need to make a phone call. Agent Diana Santos picked up on the second ring. Thaddeus Knox, I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. Diana, I need to report multiple violations of federal environmental protection statutes, and I need to request an immediate federal investigation of organized conspiracy to commit property fraud. There was a pause. Where are you right now? Miller's Coffee Shop, County Road 12. I have a witness with documented evidence of planned water contamination, fraudulent property claims, and conspiracy with out-of-state developers. Don't move. I'm 20 minutes away. Diana's voice had shifted into the all-business tone I remembered from our most serious investigations. And Thaddeus? If this is what it sounds like, you're going to need federal protection. These kinds of cases make powerful people very nervous. After I hung up, Vernon was staring at me with new understanding. You're not just a nature writer, are you? I spent 11 years with fish and wildlife enforcement, environmental crimes, waterway protection, federal land disputes. I looked at the evidence we'd spread across the table. Margot picked the wrong lake to steal, and she definitely picked the wrong person to threaten. Vernon leaned back in his seat. What happens next? Next, we wait for the FBI to arrive. Then we hand over your evidence and let federal law enforcement handle a case that's been building for 8 months. I gathered the documents back into Vernon's folder. But first, I want to know something. This morning, when you said some obligations become void when they're used to cover up fraud, did you already know this was a federal case? Vernon's smile was the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen from him all day. I spent 40 years as a corporate accountant. I know what organized financial crimes look like. I also know that federal agencies take environmental protection very seriously, especially when it involves out-of-state conspiracy and planned contamination of protected waterways. So you've been planning this conversation for weeks. I've been planning this conversation since I first saw Margot's contract with Grandview Development. Vernon's voice carried quiet satisfaction. Your grandfather spent 5 years fighting someone who had powerful local connections and unlimited legal resources, but he never had someone willing to testify about federal crimes. That changes everything. Through the coffee shop window, I could see a black SUV pulling into the parking lot. Diana Santos stepped out, followed by its Keskend agent I didn't recognize. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of federal investigators who'd been briefed on a serious case. Vernon, I said, standing to meet them at the door, I want you to know that what you're doing today is going to save my lake, my grandfather's legacy, and probably several other properties that Margot was planning to target. How do you know about other properties? I paused at the door. Because this morning, when I was reviewing federal waterway databases, I found survey requests for 6 other private lakes within a 20-mile radius, all submitted by Grandview Development, all claiming community access rights managed by local HOA representatives. Vernon's eyes widened. She's done this before. She's been building a network. Small private lakes with elderly owners, aggressive HOA claims, developer partnerships. My lake was just the latest target in a much bigger operation. I opened the door as Diana approached, but it's about to become the last one. Diana Santos walked into Miller's coffee shop, looking exactly as I remembered her. Mid-40s, silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of focused intensity that made criminals reconsider their life choices. Her partner, a younger man in a perfectly pressed suit, carried a briefcase that probably contained recording equipment and evidence bags. "Thaddeus," she said, shaking my hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. "It's been too long. Though I have to say your timing is interesting. We've been tracking unusual activity in environmental fraud cases across 3 states. Your call might be the break we've been looking for." "Diana, this is Vernon Ashworth, former HOA treasurer and the whistleblower in this case." I gestured toward our booth. "He has 8 months of documented evidence, including recorded confessions, financial records, and developer contracts." Diana's partner introduced himself as Agent Marcus Webb from the Environmental Crimes Division. As we settled back into the booth, Webb opened his briefcase and pulled out a digital recording device much more sophisticated than Vernon's hearing aid setup. "Mr. Ashworth," Diana said, "before we begin, I want you to understand that federal environmental crimes carry serious penalties if you have evidence of planned water contamination, conspiracy to defraud property owners, or organized schemes involving interstate commerce. We're talking about potential prison sentences measured in decades, not years." Vernon nodded calmly. "Agent Santos, I've spent 2 years documenting crimes that I should have reported the first time I witnessed them. I understand the stakes, and I'm ready to provide whatever testimony you need." Over the next hour, Vernon walked Diana and Webb through the entire scope of Margot's operation. The developer contracts, the planned fish population manipulation, the coordinated community pressure campaigns, the false HOA claims to properties she didn't control. Webb's questions became increasingly sharp as the evidence mounted. "Mr. Ashworth, you said Mrs. Blackwood has been collecting advance payments from developers. Do you have documentation of those transactions?" Vernon pulled out bank statements showing deposits to Margot's personal account. $50,000 from Grandview Development in March. $25,000 from something called Lakeside Resort Partners in January. Another $30,000 from Blue Ridge Development Group in November. "These aren't consulting fees," Webb noted. "These are structured to look like real estate commissions for successful property acquisitions." Diana was studying the recorded conversations with particular attention. "This discussion about fish population management, do you know if any actual contamination has occurred?" "Not yet," Vernon said. "But according to the timeline in her communications with Derek Simmons, they were planning to begin water treatment next week, right after they established documented community usage." "Water treatment means poisoning the fish population to create justification for HOA intervention," Diana summarized. "Exactly. They needed before and after evidence of environmental problems that community management could solve." Vernon's voice carried professional disgust. "Create the crisis, then position themselves as the solution that would justify developer partnership." Webb looked at me. "Thaddeus, You mentioned federal waterway protection. Have you filed environmental impact reports on this property? The lake connects to Sweetwater Creek through an underground culvert system installed in 1952. Sweetwater feeds into the Chattahoochee River, which puts my lake under federal protection as part of the navigable waterway system. I pulled out my phone and showed them the survey maps I'd downloaded from fish and wildlife databases. Any contamination of my lake would affect downstream water quality for 40 miles. Diana's expression had shifted into the focused intensity I remembered from our most serious cases. Marcus, we're looking at Clean Water Act violations, conspiracy to commit environmental fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, and potentially RICO if this network extends to other properties. It does extend to other properties, I said. Vernon, show them the survey requests. Vernon pulled out the last section of his documentation, copies of property surveys that Margot had requested through the HOA for 6 other private lakes in surrounding counties. Each survey was submitted under the justification of community access assessment or recreational facility planning. Webb studied the survey requests with growing amazement. She's been systematically targeting private waterfront properties across 3 counties. This isn't a single fraud case. This is an organized criminal enterprise. What's the federal response to something like this, Apta? I asked. Diana closed her notepad and looked at both Vernon and me with the expression I'd learned to recognize as her preparing for a complex operation. We open a multi-jurisdictional investigation. We coordinate with EPA, FBI Financial Crimes Division, and U.S. Attorney's Office for federal prosecutions. And we move fast, because once word gets out that federal agents are involved, evidence has a way of disappearing. How fast? 48 hours. Tomorrow morning we'll have search warrants for Margot Blackwood's property, HOA offices, and financial records. We'll also have coordination with local law enforcement to prevent any destruction of evidence. Diana stood up. But first, we need to make sure your property is protected. If Margot realizes that her operation has been exposed, she might try to accelerate the timeline. Webb was already on his phone, speaking in low tones to someone about immediate asset protection and federal environmental crime scene preservation. Vernon gathered his documents back into the manila folder. Agents Santos and Webb, there's one more thing you should know. Tonight, Margot scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting. She's planning to present a motion for community emergency access to the lake, with authorization for whatever measures are necessary to protect neighborhood resources. What does that mean? I asked. It means, Diana said grimly, that she's planning to force access to your property before a federal investigation can intervene. Emergency powers, community safety justification, maybe even claims that you're endangering public health by blocking access to community resources. The scope of Margot's desperation was becoming clear. She'd committed herself to delivering my lake to developers for nearly $3 million. If a federal investigation shut down her operation, she'd lose the developer money and face decades in federal prison. Thaddeus, Diana said, I need you to go home, lock your gates, and document any activity around your property. Set up cameras if you have them. If anyone attempts to access your land between now and tomorrow morning, call local law enforcement first, then call me immediately. What about the HOA meeting tonight? Webb looked up from his phone. We'll have surveillance on that meeting. If Margot authorizes any action against your property, we'll have federal agents ready to intervene. As we prepared to leave Miller's coffee shop, Diana pulled me aside. Thaddeus, I need you to understand something. What you've uncovered here connects to a federal investigation that's been building for 6 months. We've been tracking organized environmental fraud across the Southeast, and your case provides the missing link between developer groups and local property theft networks. This is bigger than just my lake. Much bigger. Vernon's evidence shows systematic property targeting, coordinated community pressure campaigns, an organized conspiracy involving millions of dollars in fraudulent development deals. Diana's voice was serious. You've given us the documentation to shut down an operation that's been destroying families and communities across multiple states. Walking to my truck, I felt the weight of everything that had happened in the past 8 hours. This morning, I'd thought I was dealing with an aggressive HOA president trying to steal Lake Acces. Now I understood I'd stumbled into an organized criminal enterprise that had been building for months. My grandfather had spent his last 5 years fighting Margot's harassment, never knowing that her attacks were part of a calculated scheme to steal his property for developer millions. He'd died believing he was protecting family land from local bullies, not federal criminals. But tomorrow morning, federal agents would begin dismantling the operation that had killed him. Margot Blackwood would learn that her 12 years of HOA power meant nothing against environmental protection statutes and federal conspiracy charges. As I drove home to Clearwater Lake, I realized that Vernon was right. Some things matter more than personal safety. My grandfather's waters ran deeper than their paperwork, and tomorrow the truth would finally surface. The emergency HOA board meeting that evening took place in the Pinehurst Community Center, a building that had seen 12 years of Margot Blackwood's increasingly authoritarian rule. By 6:45 p.m., the parking lot was packed with cars as word of the morning's confrontation had spread through social media and neighborhood group chats. I sat in my truck across the street, watching residents file into the building with expressions ranging from confused to angry. Diana Santos had positioned federal surveillance teams at 3 locations around the community center, while Agent Webb monitored communications from a mobile command unit, disguised as a cable repair van. Eleanor Whitman arrived with her husband and 3 neighbors, all carrying notebooks and what looked like printed copies of property records. Jake Riverside, the middle-aged man I'd noticed at my gate that morning, walked in with a folder thick enough to contain serious documentation. Even Sarah Chen Williams, a young mother I'd seen in Margot's original crowd, entered the building with a determined expression that suggested she'd spent the day asking hard questions. At 6:58 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Diana. All units in position. Recording equipment active. If an emergency vote is called, we move immediately. The meeting was supposed to start at 7 o'clock, but at 7:15, residents were still streaming through the front doors. According to the surveillance count, over 90 people had shown up for what was typically a 10-person board meeting. At 7:23, clipboard Craig Morrison emerged from the building and jogged toward a white sedan parked behind the community center. He was talking rapidly into his phone, gesturing frantically with his free hand. Whatever he was saying clearly involved panic. My phone rang. Diana's voice was sharp with focus. Thaddeus, Craig just called Grandview Development. He's reporting that the community demonstration failed and that federal agents have been asking questions. Margot's timeline just accelerated dramatically. What does that mean? It means she's about to do something desperate. Stay alert. Through the community center windows, I could see Margot standing at a podium in her signature light blue suit, but her usually perfect composure showed cracks. Even from across the street, her hand gestures appeared more frantic than authoritative. The crowd in front of her was larger than any HOA meeting in years, and their body language suggested they weren't there to rubber stamp her proposals. At 7:41 p.m., Vernon Ashworth's gray Honda pulled into the parking lot. He walked toward the building carrying what appeared to be a briefcase and a laptop bag. According to the plan Diana had outlined, Vernon would present his evidence to the community if Margot attempted to force an emergency vote for Lake Acces. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Jake Riverside. "Mr. Knox, this is Jake Riverside. We met this morning at your property. I wanted you to know that several of us have been researching the claims Margot made about community access rights." "What did you find?" "We found your grandfather's original property deed from 1963. We found county records showing he paid property taxes for 60 years without any community claims. And we found newspaper articles from the 1980s about him winning environmental protection awards for his lake conservation efforts." I felt a surge of gratitude toward people I barely knew. "Jake, that's incredible research." "Mr. Knox, there's something else. Margot just told the board meeting that you've threatened to poison the lake to prevent community access. She's asking for an emergency vote to authorize immediate intervention to protect community health." My blood ran cold. "That's completely false. We know. That's why Eleanor Whitman just stood up and demanded to see documented proof of your threats. The meeting is getting very heated." Through the windows, I could see increased movement inside the community center. People were standing, gesturing, clearly arguing. Margot appeared to be losing control of her own meeting. "Jake, you need to get out of that building, right now." "What do you mean?" "Federal agents are surrounding the building. If Margot tries to authorize emergency access to my property, she's going to be arrested for federal conspiracy charges. Anyone who votes with her could be considered part of the conspiracy." There was silence on Jake's end. "Federal agents? Mr. Knox, what exactly is going on here?" "Margot has been working with resort developers to steal private lakes across 3 counties. She's committed environmental fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. The FBI has been building a case for months." "Holy cow! I need to warn the others." At 7:52 p.m., my phone rang with Diana's number. "It's happening. Margot just called for an emergency vote to authorize community access to your property under health emergency provisions. Vernon is presenting his evidence to counter the vote." Through the windows, I could see Vernon at the podium with his laptop connected to a projector screen. Whatever he was showing caused immediate chaos, people jumping to their feet, shouting, pointing at Margot. "Diana, are you moving? Federal agents are entering the building now. We have Margot Blackwood under arrest for conspiracy to commit environmental fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, and organized criminal enterprise under RICO statutes." The scene inside the community center exploded into total pandemonium. Through the windows, I could see federal agents with FBI vests surrounding the podium area. Margot appeared to be arguing with 2 agents while residents backed away from the front of the room. My phone rang again. This time it was Vernon. "Mr. Knox, it's over. Federal agents just arrested Margot in front of 93 community members. She was handcuffed while trying to argue that she had emergency authority to access your property." "How did the community react?" Eleanor Whitman started applauding. Half the room joined in. Jake Riverside is collecting signatures for a petition to dissolve the current HOA board and start over with new leadership. Vernon's voice carried deep satisfaction. "But the most important thing is what Agent Santos found in Margot's briefcase." "What was in there?" "Contracts for 4 additional lakes in surrounding counties, bank deposits from 3 different development companies, and a timeline showing she was planning to contaminate your lake starting tomorrow morning with industrial herbicides disguised as algae treatment." The scope of what had almost happened hit me like a physical blow. "Vernon, she was going to poison my grandfather's lake. She was going to poison 6 lakes to create environmental crises that would justify HOA takeovers for developer partnerships. Your federal contact just told me this operation was worth over $12 million in fraudulent development deals. If you're still watching at this point, You're probably feeling the same satisfaction I felt watching federal justice unfold. This story proves that sometimes the law does work for regular people. If you agree, drop a fish emoji below to show your team justice. Agent Webb called me 20 minutes later with the complete scope of Margot's arrest. Thaddeus, we found evidence connecting her to organized property theft across 4 states. Bank records showing payments from 8 different development companies. Communications providing coordination with corrupt local officials in 3 counties. What are the charges? Federal conspiracy under RICO statutes, environmental fraud under the Clean Water Act, mail fraud, wire fraud, organized criminal enterprise, and conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism. Webb's voice carried professional satisfaction. She's looking at 25 to 40 years in federal prison. What about Grandview Development? Federal raids on their offices in Atlanta are happening as we speak. Derek Simmons and 3 other executives are being arrested for conspiracy, environmental fraud, and interstate commerce violations. Webb paused. Your case just shut down a criminal network that's been operating for over 2 years. The community center was finally emptying as federal agents completed their evidence collection. Residents walked toward their cars in small groups, talking intensely. Many stopped to look across the street toward my truck, and several waved with what appeared to be gratitude and apology. Eleanor Whitman approached my truck as I prepared to drive home. Mr. Knox, I wanted to personally apologize for this morning. Several of us feel terrible about being misled into harassing you on your own property. Mrs. Whitman, you were told lies by someone in authority. That's not your fault. We've voted to establish a new community board with Vernon Ashworth as president. He's proposed creating a voluntary lake access program with proper permits and insurance, if you'd be willing to consider it. I thought about my grandfather's dream of sharing his love for the water with people who would respect and protect it. I'd be very interested in discussing that with Vernon. My grandfather always wanted to teach children about lake conservation and responsible fishing. Eleanor's face lit up. That's exactly what Vernon suggested. An educational program with proper federal permits and environmental protection. Over the next 3 weeks, the full scope of Margot's criminal enterprise became public knowledge. Federal investigations revealed that she'd targeted private waterfront properties across Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and North Carolina, always using the same pattern. Aggressive HOA claims followed by developer partnerships that would destroy local ecosystems for resort profits. Craig Morrison cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for immunity, providing evidence that Margot had hired him to impersonate government officials on multiple properties. Garrett Phillips, the man with industrial equipment, revealed that he'd been hired to accidentally damage property belonging to 5 different lake owners who'd refused to sell. The resort development scheme had been worth over $43 million in fraudulent property acquisitions, with Margot collecting commission payments that totaled nearly $800,000 over 18 months. But the most satisfying outcome was the community response. Vernon Ashworth was unanimously elected as the new HOA president, with a mandate to establish transparent, legal, and ethical community management. Sarah Chen Williams organized a petition signed by 112 residents requesting that the new board work with me to create sustainable lake access programs. Jake Riverside volunteered to coordinate environmental education programs that would honor my grandfather's conservation legacy while providing children with opportunities to learn about water ecosystem protection. 3 months after Margot's arrest, Clearwater Lake became the county's first federally licensed environmental education program. Children from local schools visit twice monthly to learn water conservation on my grandfather's 1963 dock. Vernon often joins me during quiet evenings. Your grandfather would be proud, he said last week. His fight led to federal justice, and his lake became a model for community cooperation. That day taught me that protecting what matters requires both courage and patience. If this story of standing up to neighborhood bullies inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the good guys actually win. And if you want to help me keep exposing these power-hungry HOA schemes, that thanks button really helps support the channel. Margot received 32 years in federal prison for environmental terrorism and organized criminal enterprise. Derek Simmons got 15 to 25 years. Every evening, I watch fish jump in protected waters. The controversial gate now displays Clearwater Environmental Education Center, visitors welcome. My grandfather's legacy flows stronger than ever, deeper than criminals' paperwork, clearer than truth rising to the surface.